What if everything you thought you knew about the royal family's line of succession, its titles, and its carefully protected traditions could be overturned in a single stroke of King Charles's pen? Imagine waking up one morning to find that centuries of heritage had been stripped from a prince who was once at the very center of global fascination, only for those honors to be handed to a man barely known to the public, Sir Timothy. Shocking? It should be, because what unfolded sent shockwaves not just through Buckingham Palace, but across oceans, into Montecito, and right into the living room of Harry and Meghan themselves. And it's this seismic shift, Charles's decision to bestow Harry's titles and roles onto Sir Timothy, that has triggered an uproar the monarchy hasn't seen in decades. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But let's not jump too quickly. Let's sit with the weight of that decision for a moment. A king, long accused of wavering, indecisive leadership, suddenly makes a move so bold, so cutting, that even his fiercest critics stood stunned. Why now? Why Sir Timothy? And why at Harry's expense? Those are the questions echoing across Britain, whispered in the marble halls of the palace, and screamed across tabloids and talk shows alike. This isn't just about royal titles. This is about betrayal, power, legacy, and the deep fractures inside a family that once promised the world unity. Picture the scene. Montecito, California. The sunlit mansion where Harry and Meghan carved out their post-royal lives. The very place they hoped to find peace away from the harsh scrutiny of the press. Suddenly, that sanctuary became a pressure cooker. Calls from London, frantic texts from allies, a tidal wave of headlines screaming the same thing. Sir Timothy had become what Harry no longer was. Every title that once anchored Harry to the House of Windsor, every role that once defined him, was gone. And Meghan's reaction? Well, neighbors would later whisper about the raised voices, the sound of slammed doors, and even the unmistakable image of Harry pacing the grounds, his phone glued to his ear, his face ashen. Here's the truth. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was years in the making. Years of tension between father and son. Years of scandal, interviews, memoirs, and truth bombs that fractured trust beyond repair. And while Harry sought freedom in California, Charles quietly nurtured loyalty elsewhere. That loyalty had a name, Sir Timothy, a man who, unlike Harry, had never stepped outside the lines. A man who had pledged allegiance not through words on Oprah, but through decades of quiet, steadfast service. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Many people outside Britain barely know who Sir Timothy is. To most, he was a background figure, the type of man who appears in royal processions, but whose name you forget moments later. Yet within palace walls, Sir Timothy was a cornerstone, a confidant, a loyal soldier, a shadow carrying burdens others couldn't. Some call him Charles's most trusted ally. Others whisper he was the spare the king always wanted but never had. And now, with this decision, Charles has finally said it out loud. Sir Timothy is the one I trust with Harry's legacy. Let's pause. How does that land with you? Betrayal? Justice? Irony? Think about the story Harry told the world, the son suffocating under the shadow of his brother, desperate to find freedom. He gave up his titles, his roles, his proximity to the crown, but maybe he never expected his father to fill the gap so ruthlessly. And not with William, not with Anne, not with a bloodline royal, but with Sir Timothy. That choice speaks volumes. And it begs the question, was this about Harry's mistakes, or was it about Charles's power? The timing couldn't have been more brutal. Montecito was already a circus of paparazzi and speculation, with Meghan allegedly scrambling to hold on to relevance after a string of canceled deals. Harry, torn between loyalty to his wife and nostalgia for his homeland, had been quietly making overtures to family members. A phone call here, a private letter there, hints that maybe, just maybe, he was hoping for reconciliation. And then, like a guillotine falling, Charles's decision cut through it all. Every bridge Harry thought he might rebuild was suddenly in. Who exactly is Sir Timothy, and why did King Charles choose him of all people to replace Prince Harry? That's the burning question, isn't it? Because this decision wasn't just about giving away a title. It was about rewriting the story of loyalty, power, and trust inside one of the most scrutinized families in the world. And here's the catch. While Harry and Meghan soaked up headlines, interviews, and Netflix deals, Sir Timothy worked quietly, almost invisibly, in the background. Silent, loyal, patient, waiting. Let's strip this back. Imagine the royal family as a grand theater production. Everyone knows the stars: the Queen, Charles, William, Harry, even Meghan. They're front and center, bathed in light, scrutinized from every angle. But what about the stagehands? The ones who move the scenery, keep the lights working, and make sure the show doesn't collapse? Sir Timothy was that man, unseen by most of us, indispensable to the people who matter. And when Charles needed someone to step into Harry's shoes, he didn't look to the spotlight. He looked backstage. But who is he really? Sir Timothy Lawrence. You might know the name faintly, whispered in articles about Princess Anne. That's right. He's not a Windsor by birth. He married into the family. A naval officer. A knight. A man with no royal blood running through his veins, but with something perhaps even more valuable in Charles's eyes. A record of loyalty unmarred by scandal. Let's pause here. Think about that contrast. Harry, born into the institution, carries the blood of Diana and Charles, the very definition of royal pedigree. Yet he's the one cast out, replaced by someone with no drop of royal heritage. Does that not strike you as ironic? Does it not make you question whether blood is truly thicker than water when it comes to the crown? Sir Timothy's story begins far from the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. A naval career that taught him discipline, discretion, and duty. Unlike Harry, he didn't wear uniforms for ceremonial photo ops. He earned them in service. Long deployments, commands at sea, decisions that could mean life or death. By the time he entered royal circles, he wasn't some pampered aristocrat. He was a man forged in the cold steel of the Navy. And maybe that's exactly what Charles wanted, a man hardened by service, not softened by privilege. And then came Anne, Princess and the Queen's only daughter, known for her no-nonsense approach, her work ethic, her disdain for drama. When Timothy married, and in 1992, he stepped into a world that eats most people alive. But here's the twist. He didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't court publicity. He didn't give interviews or leak stories. He simply stood by and, quietly supporting her, never outshining her, never stumbling into scandal. Compare that to Meghan. Compare that to Harry. Does the difference not slap you in the face? Now, let's be clear. Timothy wasn't always a saint in the eyes of the press. His relationship with Anne began while she was still married, sparking whispers of scandal. But notice how quickly that faded. Why? Because instead of fueling the fire with reckless behavior, Timothy doubled down on restraint. He learned the art of discretion in the Navy, and he carried it into royal life. No Oprah tell-all, no ghostwritten memoir, no Netflix docuseries, just silence, loyalty, presence. And over time, that silence became his power. So why now? Why would Charles suddenly elevate him into Harry's abandoned roles? The answer lies in the stark contrast between the two men. One, a prince by birth, consumed by the need to tell his truth, clashing endlessly with the institution. The other, a knight by service, who never spoke out of turn, who never embarrassed the crown, who never demanded the spotlight. In a monarchy built on appearances, which man would you trust? Which man would you bet the survival of the crown on? Ask yourself this. Is it possible that Charles saw in Timothy the son he wished he had? A man who doesn't rebel, doesn't question, doesn't run to California at the first sign of conflict. A man who stays. Because let's not forget, at the heart of monarchy lies one principle above all others: duty. Harry walked away from duty. Timothy never did. And that's why we're here, talking about this seismic decision. But the irony doesn't stop there. Sir Timothy, a man mocked by some for being too plain, too quiet, too dull, is suddenly the center of a storm that makes him anything but. He is now the man carrying the roles Harry once clung to: military patronages, charitable leaderships, the symbolic weight of centuries. And for Harry, watching this from across the ocean, it must feel like a knife twisting deeper with every headline. Because Timothy isn't just replacing him. He's outshining him. Here's the emotional beat. Imagine Harry, scrolling through the news, seeing photographs of Timothy in uniforms he once wore, shaking hands with veterans he once championed, standing at podiums he once commanded. Imagine the fury, the humiliation, the sense of being erased not by a brother, not by a rival, but by a man the public barely knew existed until now. That's the cruelty of Charles's choice. It wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. It was a statement that loyalty, even from an outsider, trumps blood if that blood turns disloyal. And what about the public? At first, confusion. Who is this man? Why him? But then, slowly, a narrative emerged. Here was someone who never complained, never caused embarrassment, never asked for sympathy. For a weary British public tired of Sussex drama, Timothy became almost refreshing, reliable, steady, a reminder of what monarchy is supposed to be. And that public perception matters. Because if the people embrace Timothy as the anti-Harry, then Charles's gamble pays off. Still, questions linger. Was this truly about honoring Timothy, or was it about punishing Harry? Did Charles choose him out of admiration, or out of spite? And what does this mean for the future? Could Timothy's rise signal an even deeper reshuffling of roles, one that edges Harry's branch of the family further and further into obscurity? You see, Timothy's story isn't just about loyalty. It's about timing. He's been there for decades, in the background, waiting. And when the moment came, when Charles finally had enough of Harry's defiance, Timothy was ready. Right man, right place, right time. But here's where it gets even darker. Some insiders claim this wasn't just about Charles's decision, that others within the palace, and William, even Camilla, pushed for Timothy's rise. If true, that means Harry wasn't just replaced by a loyal servant. He was ousted by a coalition within his own family. Imagine the weight of that betrayal. Imagine realizing that not one, but many hands signed your exile. And so we return to the question we started with. Who is Sir Timothy? He's not just a naval officer turned royal consort. He's not Justin's quiet husband. He's the man Charles chose to embody the very roles Harry abandoned. He's the symbol of loyalty rewarded, of rebellion punished, of a monarchy that values discretion over drama. But what happens when that symbol is tested? Because make no mistake, stepping into Harry's roles won't be easy. The scrutiny will come. The pressure will build. And Timothy, who has spent decades in the shadows, will find himself dragged into the very spotlight he has avoided. And when that spotlight exposes him, when the world digs deeper into his past, will he withstand it? Or will cracks begin to show? Because what came next wasn't about Timothy's rise. It was about Harry's fall. And the stripping of his titles was only the beginning. What happens when a prince loses everything that once defined him? Titles, roles, the very essence of his place in a 1,000-year-old institution. Can you even imagine what that feels like? To be born into royalty, only to watch your father erase your name from history with the stroke of a pen? That's not just humiliation. That's annihilation. And that's exactly what happened to Prince Harry. This wasn't some quiet administrative change tucked away in dusty royal records. No, it was a deliberate, public stripping of titles. A decision Charles knew the world would see, the press would devour, and Harry would never recover from. And let's be clear, it didn't happen overnight. The monarchy doesn't move that way. This was calculated, discussed in corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens, debated by advisors who weighed tradition against rebellion, and finally, decided by Charles, who, for once, chose decisiveness over delay. Picture it. The king, seated in his study at Clarence House, papers before him, draft decrees prepared, the weight of history pressing down. And with his signature, Harry went from His Royal Highness, the Duke of Sussex, Captain General of the Royal Marines, Commonwealth Youth Ambassador, to nothing. Stripped, dispossessed, titles gone, roles reassigned. Sir Timothy elevated. Can you hear the echo of that silence? The silence after centuries of tradition were broken? Here's the contradiction. Harry once told the world he didn't care about titles. He said they meant nothing. He said freedom was worth more than formality. And yet, when the news broke, when he learned that the titles he'd dismissed were being handed to another man, the pain was undeniable. Because the truth is, titles aren't just words. They're identity. They're power. They're the invisible shield that separates a prince from a common man. And Harry, raised with that shield his whole life, was suddenly unprotected. Let's dig deeper. The Duke of Sussex. That wasn't just a name. It was centuries of history tied to one man. Military patronages. Those weren't just ceremonies. They were bonds with soldiers, veterans, and families who once saw Harry as their champion. Imagine their confusion now, saluting another man in Harry's place. And the Commonwealth Youth Ambassador role? That was Harry's global platform, his stage to present himself as Diana's heir, a voice for a new generation. Gone. Vanished. Reassigned. Do you feel the irony? Harry, who left the UK claiming he wanted to be free from duty, suddenly confronted with the brutal truth. Without those roles, he was just another celebrity in Montecito. No higher than the Hollywood figures Meghan courted. No different than the tech executives and influencers who surrounded them. Titles, once shrugged off, became the very thing he couldn't live without. And how did he learn? Not through a warm, fatherly conversation. Not with a gentle warning. But through the press. Through leaks that spread like wildfire across tabloids and screens. King Charles reassigns Prince Harry's roles to Sir Timothy. Headlines screamed it. News anchors dissected it. Social media mocked it. Can you picture Harry's face as he scrolled his phone that morning? The disbelief. The anger. The crushing weight of realizing he wasn't just sidelined. He was erased. But here's the emotional gut punch. Imagine Harry explaining it to his children. Archie and Lilibet, too young to understand, yet one day old enough to Google their father's name. What will they find? A prince who abandoned his duties, lost his titles, and was replaced by another man. What will Harry tell them? That he gave it all up for freedom? Or that freedom came at the cost of everything else? And Meghan, oh Meghan, her reaction was fire. Because this wasn't just about Harry losing titles. It was about her losing leverage. Think about it. Every deal they signed, Netflix, Spotify, book contracts, was inked with the aura of royalty. Strip that away, and what remains? Meghan Markle, actress. Harry Windsor, former prince. The shine dulls. The power fades. And in Montecito, that reality must have hit like a thunderclap. Neighbors later whispered about the ruckus in the Sussex mansion the day the news broke. Raised voices. Tense pacing. A phone call overheard. Harry's voice cracking as he demanded answers from aides who wouldn't pick up. Meghan reportedly furious, calling it a betrayal, insisting the palace was out to destroy them. But the truth? This wasn't destruction. It was consequence. Years of defiance, interviews, memoirs, and accusations had led to this moment. And Charles, finally, had his answer. But was it just about punishment? Or was it about survival? Some palace insiders insist Charles saw no other choice. The monarchy's survival depends on loyalty, tradition, and the public's respect. Harry had become a liability. Every time he opened his mouth, the crown took a hit. Every time he gave an interview, trust eroded. And so Charles chose to cut out the infection before it spread further. Harsh, yes, but in the cold world of monarchy, survival trumps sentiment. Ask yourself this. Was Charles cruel, or was he pragmatic? Was this the act of a father who had lost patience with his son, or of a king who put the crown before family? And more importantly, was this a warning to others in the family who might one day rebel? Because make no mistake, this decision didn't just strip Harry. It sent a message. Loyalty will be rewarded. Defiance will be erased. Now, let's consider the public. Reactions were divided, of course. Some cheered Charles for finally taking control, for showing strength after years of being portrayed as weak. Others wept for Harry, seeing him as a son cast aside by a cold father. Social media exploded with memes, hashtags, fiery debates. And through it all, one truth became clear. Harry's identity as a prince was gone. The world no longer saw him as His Royal Highness. They saw him as the man who lost it all. And how did Sir Timothy feel, stepping into Harry's shoes? That's the question no one can quite answer. Some say he accepted with quiet dignity, fully aware of the storm it would cause. Others claim he hesitated, knowing the public backlash would be fierce. But whether he wanted it or not, the titles were his. The roles were his. And Harry's were no longer. But the story doesn't end here. Because the stripping of titles was just the surface. Beneath it lay hidden motives, secret files, and long-buried grievances that pushed Charles to act. And when those secrets began to surface, they revealed something far darker than anyone expected. Because what came next wasn't just about punishment. It was about exposing truths Harry and Meghan never wanted the world to see. And when those truths came out, Montecito would never be the same again. What happens when the dream you built your entire future on starts crumbling before your very eyes? What happens when the titles you once shrugged off suddenly become the very lifeline you can't live without? For Meghan Markle, that moment came like a lightning bolt the day she learned that King Charles had stripped Harry, and by extension, her, from every title, every role, every shred of royal authority, only to hand it all to Sir Timothy. Her reaction? Explosive. Neighbors in Montecito would later whisper about it. A slam of a door. Shouts echoing through the sprawling mansion. Curtains pulled shut in broad daylight. Meghan, pacing the marble floors with her phone clutched tight, her voice sharp, her tone panicked. Harry, silent, sunk into one of their oversized armchairs, staring down at his phone like a man reading his own obituary. Do you see the irony here? Meghan once stood before the world, defiantly saying she didn't care for titles, that she wanted freedom over formality, authenticity over antiquated rules. And yet, when those titles vanished, when the royal machine stripped them away and handed them to another, the panic was unmistakable. Because the truth, the raw truth, is that those titles weren't just empty words, they were power. They were leverage. They were the golden thread that tied her and Harry to the monarchy, even as they claimed to reject it. And losing them wasn't just a personal humiliation. It was a professional disaster. Think about it. Netflix didn't pay millions to work with Harry Windsor and Meghan Markle. They paid for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Book publishers didn't salivate over stories from a former actress. They wanted tales from inside the palace, from a prince and his wife. Every brand deal, every contract, every handshake, they were all predicated on the weight of royalty. Strip that away, and what remains? Just another Hollywood couple struggling to stay relevant in a town that devours the next big story every hour. But Meghan wasn't about to sit quietly and watch her empire collapse. No, that's not who she is. She's a fighter, a strategist, someone who knows how to play the game of perception. And in that moment, surrounded by crisis managers, lawyers, and PR advisors flown in at a moment's notice, she began to plot her counterattack. The first step? Control the narrative. Phones rang nonstop. Calls to Netflix executives, insisting this decision only made their story more compelling. Emails fired off to sympathetic journalists, framing Meghan as the victim of a cold, vengeful monarchy. Whispers about racism, sexism, and generational trauma resurfaced, ready to be weaponized again. If Charles wanted to silence her by stripping titles, she would make noise louder than ever before. But here's where it gets complicated. For every spin Meghan tried to put out, the reality kept seeping through. The optics were brutal. Headlines weren't painting her as a victim. They were mocking her. Montecito meltdown. Duchess no more. Meghan furious as titles handed to Anne's husband. The narrative she tried to control slipped like sand through her fingers. And the harder she fought, the more the public saw desperation. And then came the contradiction. Meghan, who built her public image on feminism, on independence, on rejecting archaic systems, suddenly clawing for the very titles she once condemned. Can you feel that tension? That sharp sting of hypocrisy? It wasn't lost on the public. Social media exploded with old clips of her interviews, spliced with current headlines, painting her as a woman who wanted her cake and to eat it too. Still, behind closed doors, Meghan refused to back down. She reminded Harry, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, that this wasn't just about him. It was about their children. Archie and Lilibet, born into a web of uncertainty, already fighting for recognition, were now effectively erased from the royal ledger. No titles, no protections, no guarantees. And for Meghan, that was unacceptable. Because what does a mother fear most? That her children will grow up stripped of the legacy that could have been theirs. So, she doubled down. Plans were whispered about new interviews. A tell-all that would make Spare look like a bedtime story. Friends of Meghan spoke about her considering a Netflix revenge documentary, one that would expose not just Charles, but the entire machinery of the monarchy. Could you imagine the fallout if that ever aired? Meghan, camera ready, voice trembling with controlled outrage, accusing the king of deliberately erasing his own grandchildren. It would be dynamite, but it would also be dangerous, because every bombshell she dropped made reconciliation impossible. And Harry? Where was he in all this? Torn. On one hand, his loyalty to Meghan was unwavering. On the other, he couldn't deny the raw wound inflicted by his father. Late-night calls reportedly rang unanswered. Messages sent to William returned cold. Harry, once a soldier who thrived under pressure, now found himself paralyzed in his own home. Meghan pushed for action. Harry sank deeper into despair. And in that gap between them, Montecito's walls shook with tension. Do you see the emotional storm building? On the outside, calm California skies. On the inside, thunder, lightning, fire. A couple once united against the monarchy, now fracturing under the weight of its retaliation. And yet, Meghan wasn't done. She looked at Sir Timothy, the man who had stolen her husband's roles, and saw a target. Whispers began to emerge that Meghan was digging into his past. Journalists tipped off about his naval career, his marriage to, and his reputation for discretion. Could there be skeletons in Timothy's closet? Could Meghan find something to discredit him, to make the world question Charles's choice? If so, she would expose it. If not, she would manufacture doubt. Because in the world of perception, doubt is enough. But here's the twist. The harder Meghan fought, the stronger Charles seemed to become. Every attempt to spin the story backfired. Every whisper campaign fizzled. Sir Timothy, quiet as ever, refused to play the game. He didn't respond to accusations. He didn't give interviews. He simply stood tall, dignified, silent, and in doing so, made Meghan look louder, angrier, more desperate. The contrast was devastating, and the public noticed. Polls began shifting. Sympathy drained from Montecito and flowed back to the monarchy. For the first time in years, Charles looked decisive. William looked supportive. Even Camilla gained quiet approval. Meghan, meanwhile, was cast as the woman who couldn't stop fighting battles she had already lost. But let me ask you this. Was that really the end for Meghan? Do you think she would ever accept defeat? Or was this outrage in Montecito merely the first chapter of a war she was determined to wage? Because what came next wasn't just angry phone calls or PR campaigns. It was something bigger, something darker. A ruckus in Montecito that would spill beyond their mansion walls and into the streets, the headlines, the very soul of the community they called home. And when it did, the world would realize this wasn't just a family feud anymore. It was a full-scale royal war. How quickly does a private family feud become a global spectacle? In the age of 24-hour news cycles, social media feeds, and viral headlines, the answer is simple: instantly. The moment King Charles's decision was announced, stripping Prince Harry of his titles and roles and handing them to Sir Timothy, the world ignited. Newspapers printed special editions. TV anchors interrupted regular programming. Twitter trended in every country, hashtags exploding with fury, mockery, and disbelief. It was chaos. And yet, it wasn't chaos by accident. The palace didn't just announce the change. They timed it. They choreographed it. They knew the world was watching. They wanted the world to watch. Because nothing in royal life happens without careful calculation. And this decision wasn't just about Harry. It was about sending a message to everyone. The headlines were merciless. King erases the spare. Harry's crown crumbles. Sir Timothy, the new royal power. Tabloids splashed split-screen images of Harry looking haggard in Montecito against Sir Timothy in crisp naval attire, shaking hands with veterans or standing beside Anne. The symbolism was brutal. One man diminished. Another exalted. The press had their narrative, and they weren't about to let go. But here's where the contradictions cut deepest. For years, Harry and Meghan claimed the press destroyed them, that the media fueled their decision to leave. And yet, now, with the press against them like never before, they needed that very same media machine to survive. Meghan scrambled to leak counter-narratives. Friendly journalists framed her as the victim of Charles's cruelty. Netflix allies hinted that this drama would make for even juicier content. But the global tide was too strong. The overwhelming story wasn't sympathy. It was mockery. Think about it. Memes flooded TikTok and Instagram. Harry photoshopped as a dethroned king. Meghan portrayed as a director screaming "cut," while Sir Timothy calmly walked into frame. Twitter threads mocked their Montecito meltdown. YouTube commentators churned out endless videos dissecting every angle, every whisper, every imagined insult. For once, Harry and Meghan weren't controlling the conversation. They were the punchline, and the global press didn't speak with one voice. The UK tabloids were gleeful, almost celebratory, painting Charles as a strong king finally reclaiming authority. The American media, more divided, debated whether Charles was cruel or courageous. European outlets leaned towards sympathy for Harry, but admitted the symbolism was striking. Even in far-flung places, India, Australia, South Africa, the story dominated front pages. The monarchy, once seen as a relic, was suddenly alive again in global conversation. Do you see the irony? Harry and Meghan claimed they left to live a quieter, freer life. Yet, with one royal decree, they were thrust back into the harshest spotlight imaginable, and this time, not as rebels rewriting the story, but as the villains of a tragedy they no longer controlled. And Harry? His silence screamed louder than words. No interviews, no statements, just paparazzi shots of him driving in Montecito, head down, jaw clenched, the image of a man cornered. Meghan, meanwhile, allegedly tried to line up a sit-down with major networks, but producers hesitated. Why? Because the public mood had shifted. Sympathy fatigue had set in. Viewers weren't looking for another round of "the royals mistreated us." They wanted drama. They wanted conflict. And Meghan's outrage risked sounding like recycled excuses. But the frenzy didn't stop at headlines and memes. Protesters appeared outside Buckingham Palace. Some waved banners reading, "Justice for Harry." Others shouted, "Loyalty to the king." The monarchy had polarized the public like never before. And across the Atlantic, Montecito itself became a battlefield. Reporters camped outside the Sussex mansion. Neighbors complained of drones buzzing overhead. Restaurants nearby were flooded with paparazzi, hoping to catch even a glimpse of Meghan storming out or Harry sulking inside. And let's not forget the cruelest twist of all, the veterans. Harry had once been their champion, their brother-in-arms. His work with Invictus Games had made him a hero in their eyes. Now, those very same veterans were shaking hands with Sir Timothy. Photographs circulated of Timothy in full naval uniform, smiling warmly at wounded soldiers, laying wreaths on memorials, speaking about duty and sacrifice. The very roles Harry once held dear were gone, and the images made it painfully real. Veterans once loyal to Harry were now seen standing beside his replacement. What does that do to a man's soul? To watch the people you fought for, the causes you championed, the communities you built, suddenly shift their allegiance? That's not just professional loss. That's personal devastation. And Harry, sitting in California, scrolling through those pictures, must have felt the sting in every bone of his body. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Some insiders whispered that the palace intentionally released those images of Timothy, that they staged them to rub salt in Harry's wounds. Was it cruel strategy? Or was it simply the reality of a new royal figure stepping into old shoes? Either way, the optics were undeniable. Harry was being erased in real time, and the media was eating it alive. And the world? The world couldn't look away. Talk shows dissected it daily. Experts argued about whether Charles had gone too far. Journalists dug into Timothy's past, scouring for anything scandalous, though finding very little. Social commentators debated Meghan's hypocrisy. Was she a feminist icon or a power-hungry opportunist? Was Harry a victim of cold royal machinery, or the architect of his own downfall? The questions piled higher and higher, and the answers only deepened the frenzy. Let me ask you this. Can a man survive when the world mocks his every move? Can a couple thrive when their brand collapses under ridicule? Or do they eventually implode, turning their fury inward? Because as the media storm raged, Montecito's walls began to close in. Meghan's fury grew sharper. Harry's silence grew heavier. Their children, shielded from cameras, lived in a house buzzing with tension. And still, the headlines came. Still, the memes spread. Still, the world laughed. But here's the contradiction that no one saw coming. For all the humiliation Harry and Meghan endured, for all the mocking headlines and relentless memes, the media frenzy didn't just damage them. It also breathed new life into the monarchy itself. Charles looked strong. William looked steady. The institution, battered for years, suddenly appeared rejuvenated. And Sir Timothy, the quiet man in the shadows, was now a household name. The man nobody expected to care about became the symbol of stability. Do you see the twist? By trying to escape the monarchy, Harry and Meghan had unwittingly revived it. Their downfall became Charles's victory. Their outrage became Timothy's coronation. But the storm was far from over. Because behind the scenes, while the world laughed, darker whispers circulated. Whispers of hidden motives, of secret files, of decisions rooted not in honor, but in vengeance. And those whispers would soon surface, shattering whatever illusions remained. Because what came next wasn't just about global shock. It was about uncovering the hidden reasons behind Charles's brutal move. And when those secrets were revealed, the world would realize the stripping of titles was only the beginning. Why did King Charles do it? Why strip his own son of centuries-old titles and hand them to Sir Timothy, a man the world barely knew? Was it a cold calculation of survival, or was it something more personal, something rooted in years of hurt, resentment, and betrayal? That's the question everyone's asking, and the answer isn't as simple as loyalty versus rebellion. Because in the palace, motives are never singular. They're layered, contradictory, hidden in shadows. Let's start with the obvious. On the surface, Charles framed his decision as recognition. Recognition of Sir Timothy's service, loyalty, and discretion. The king's statement, polished by aides, spoke of stability in uncertain times and honoring those who have upheld duty without complaint. Sounds noble, doesn't it? Almost poetic. But look deeper, and you see something else, a veiled rebuke of Harry. The words, without complaint, cut sharper than any sword. They were aimed squarely at the son who gave interview after interview, memoir after memoir, complaint after complaint. Do you see the contradiction? Charles, a man once accused of being weak, indecisive, even self-pitying, now standing firm, calling out his son not directly, but symbolically. That's how monarchs fight their wars. Not with fists, not with shouts, but with gestures that echo through history. And this gesture? It was devastating. But here's where it gets more complicated. Behind palace walls, insiders whisper that this wasn't just about service. It was about control. Harry, by leaving, by speaking out, by exposing secrets, had wrested control from the monarchy. He had set his own narrative, and worse, he had made money off it. To Charles, that wasn't just betrayal. That was a direct threat to the monarchy's survival. Because what happens if one prince leaves and profits from tearing down the crown? What's to stop others from doing the same? So Charles acted, not just to punish Harry, but to set an example, a warning, a line in the sand. Loyalty will be rewarded. Betrayal will be erased. And to prove the point, he needed someone to fill the vacuum. Not William. Too close, too politically charged. Not, and already respected, but not a symbol of replacement. No, Charles needed someone unexpected. Someone quiet. Someone who embodied the very opposite of Harry. Sir Timothy. And that's where the hidden motives begin to show. Because choosing Timothy wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. It was a way of saying, I don't need you, Harry. I can build this monarchy without you. Even with a man who has no royal blood, I am stronger than your rebellion. Can you feel the sting of that? A father telling his son not through words, but through actions, that he is disposable, that his bloodline isn't sacred. That loyalty from an outsider trumps betrayal from a son. But was it really just Charles? Some say no. Whispers inside the palace suggest a coalition pushed him toward this decision. And, fiercely loyal to Timothy, allegedly lobbied for him. William, tired of his brother's constant attacks, reportedly supported the move as a way to neutralize Harry once and for all. Even Camilla, often underestimated, is said to have nudged Charles, reminding him that strength defines kingship, not sentiment. If true, then Charles wasn't just acting as a father. He was acting as a king under pressure, cornered by his closest advisors, forced to choose between son and survival. And let's not forget history. Charles himself knows what it's like to be humiliated by the crown. Remember how the Queen, his own mother, often sidelined him, elevating others in the family while Charles waited decades for his turn? The pain of being overshadowed by Diana, adored while he was scorned? That pain doesn't vanish. It festers. And when Charles finally became king, perhaps he vowed never to let disobedience undermine him again. Perhaps Harry's rebellion triggered something deeper, a determination to prove that he would not be weak, that he would not allow history to repeat itself. Now here's where the contradictions pile up. Charles, the father, punishing his son. Charles, the king, protecting the crown. Charles, the man once pitted for indecision, now praised for ruthlessness. Which version is true? Maybe all of them. Maybe none. Because in the monarchy, truth is rarely clean. It's messy, it's layered, and it's always hidden beneath polished statements and carefully staged photos. But motives don't just hide in words. They hide in documents. And according to palace sources, there were files, old files, secret files, that shaped Charles's decision. Reports of conversations Harry had with staff. Accounts of behavior kept off the record for years. Financial documents tracing the fallout of Sussex deals. These files, allegedly presented to Charles in the weeks leading up to the decision, painted a picture not of a loyal son gone astray, but of a liability too dangerous to keep tied to the crown. And when Charles saw those files, the choice was no longer emotional. It was inevitable. Still, ask yourself this: was it truly inevitable? Or did Charles seize the moment, using the files as justification for a decision he already wanted to make? After all, monarchs rarely admit when they act out of anger. They cloak their fury in reason, their vengeance in duty. Could this stripping of titles have been Charles's revenge for years of humiliation at Harry's hands? Revenge disguised as necessity? And here's the irony. By making this move, Charles did exactly what Harry accused the monarchy of doing for years, putting the institution above family, choosing survival over love, duty over compassion, in trying to prove Harry wrong. Did Charles actually prove him right? That's the contradiction at the heart of this drama. A father who claims to love his son, showing the world that love is conditional, transactional, bound by the walls of Buckingham Palace. The global press speculated endlessly. Some said Charles had finally grown a spine. Others said he had hardened his heart. Psychologists debated whether this was parental estrangement reaching its cruel climax. Political analysts wondered if the move was meant to stabilize the monarchy in the eyes of the Commonwealth, where criticism of the royals has been growing louder. Everyone had a theory. No one had the whole truth. And Harry? For him, the motives didn't matter. All that mattered was the result. The titles were gone. The roles were gone. The legacy was gone. Erased. Reassigned. And every explanation, every justification, every polished palace statement meant nothing compared to the raw wound of a father telling his son, "You are no longer needed." But here's the darker question. If Charles could do this to Harry, his own son, what else is he capable of? What other moves might he make to secure the crown? Because stripping Harry was bold. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And behind closed doors, the whispers grew louder. Whispers of secrets still buried. Whispers of files that hadn't yet seen the light. Whispers of a storm still to come. And when those whispers became reality, when the secrets finally surfaced, the world would realize Charles's motives weren't just hidden. They were explosive. Because what came next would expose truths that shattered the monarchy's carefully crafted image and left even Montecito trembling. What if I told you that buried deep in the vaults of Buckingham Palace were files, documents so explosive, so damning, that they didn't just explain why King Charles stripped Harry of his titles, but revealed truths the royal family never wanted the world to see? Would you believe it? Or would you dismiss it as rumor, as conspiracy? Because here's the shocking part. These files weren't whispers anymore. They were real. They existed. And once their contents began to leak, the entire monarchy trembled. It started quietly. A whisper among aides. A late-night briefing that ran longer than expected. Charles hunched over a stack of papers, his pen tapping nervously against the desk. These weren't just reports. They were records, kept for years, even decades. Internal memos, staff complaints, financial audits, notes from meetings with advisors, even transcripts of private conversations. Each page told a story, and together, they painted a picture Charles could no longer ignore. And at the center of those files, Prince Harry. Let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself this. Why would a monarchy so obsessed with secrecy keep such meticulous records of one man's life? The answer is simple. Control. The palace documents everything, not just to preserve history, but to prepare for crises. Every complaint from staff, every unusual financial decision, every instance of temper, every questionable remark, it all goes on paper. Because in a system built on perception, knowledge is the crown's greatest weapon. So what did those files reveal? First, they revealed patterns of behavior. Reports from aides dating back to Harry's bachelor days spoke of volatility, of moods that swung like pendulums. Some described shouting matches behind closed doors. Others claimed Harry often defied protocol, ignoring security advice, demanding exceptions. At the time, these reports were brushed aside. Boys will be boys, they said. But years later, with Harry openly defying the monarchy from California, those old patterns looked less like youthful mistakes and more like warnings ignored. Second, the files contained financial records. Spreadsheets showing how funds were used, how expenses ballooned, how projects Harry pushed forward often went over budget. And while no one accused him outright of corruption, the narrative was clear. Harry's judgment with money was shaky. For a family that survives on public funds, image is everything. A prince who appears careless with finances becomes a liability. Third, and perhaps most devastating, were the transcripts. Notes from private conversations between Harry and senior staff. Moments where he expressed disdain for the institution, where he questioned its purpose, where he mocked traditions others held sacred. Words spoken in frustration, maybe, but once written down, they became weapons. Imagine those transcripts placed in front of Charles, his son not just rejecting the crown publicly, but mocking it privately for years. Could any king ignore that? And then came the bombshell. Among the files was a report, heavily redacted, suggesting that Harry had considered writing his memoir long before leaving the royal family. Meetings with publishers were hinted at. Draft outlines mentioned. If true, it meant that Harry's truth-telling wasn't a spontaneous act of liberation, but a calculated plan years in the making. To Charles, that was betrayal of the highest order. Because it wasn't just rebellion. It was premeditated rebellion. But here's where the contradictions sting. Harry always claimed he left because the institution suffocated him. But the files suggested he had been planning his escape, even profiting from it, while still wearing the crown. Ask yourself this. Does that make him a victim or an opportunist? Now imagine Meghan's face when she learned these files existed. According to palace insiders, Charles didn't just read them in private. He confronted Harry with them in one final attempt at reconciliation. A late-night call, icy in tone, in which Charles reportedly told his son, "I have the records. I know the truth." Meghan, standing beside Harry, allegedly urged him to deny everything. But Harry stayed silent. Silence that, in Charles's eyes, was confirmation enough. And so the decision was made. Titles stripped, roles reassigned, Sir Timothy elevated, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, or at least, that's how Charles justified it. Because once those files were laid bare, the king could no longer gamble on his son's loyalty. But the files didn't stay locked away. No secret in the palace ever does. Pieces of them began to leak. A journalist hinted at internal reports proving Charles's hand was forced. A commentator on live TV referenced transcripts showing Harry's disdain. Slowly, fragments trickled into the public sphere. And with each leak, public opinion shifted further. Sympathy for Harry evaporated. Questions about Meghan's influence deepened. And the narrative of betrayal grew heavier. Now here's the emotional beat. Imagine Harry, sitting in Montecito, watching the world consume these leaks. Headlines quoting his own words against him. Old staff members resurfacing, corroborating stories. Projects he once championed now portrayed as careless indulgences. Imagine the humiliation of realizing the institution you thought you escaped had receipts. Receipts that could destroy you at will. And Meghan? Her fury doubled. She reportedly called the leaks character assassination, insisting they were lies, distortions, half-truths. But the public didn't care. Once the files entered the conversation, they became gospel. And the harder Meghan fought, the more people believed Charles's version of events. Because silence from the king looked like dignity, while noise from Montecito looked like desperation. But ask yourself, why now? Why release the files at this moment? Was it purely to justify Charles's decision? Or was it a larger strategy, an intentional effort to crush Harry's credibility once and for all? Some say the timing was deliberate. That Charles waited until Harry's popularity in America began to dip, until Netflix soured on the Sussexes, until Meghan's brand wobbled. And then, with precision, he struck. The files weren't just a defense. They were an offensive strike. And here's the twist. Among the files were rumors of something even more explosive, documents not yet leaked, but whispered about. Papers suggesting deeper family rifts. Letters hinting at conversations about Archie and Lilibet's titles. Notes about Meghan's treatment of staff, about power struggles behind palace walls. Files that, if released, could shatter what little remained of Harry and Meghan's reputation. Were they real? Were they exaggerations? Nobody knew. But the fear of them kept Meghan up at night, pacing those Montecito halls, demanding Harry fight back harder. Now let me ask you this. How much damage can a family survive before it breaks forever? Is there a point where betrayal becomes irreparable, where forgiveness is no longer possible? Because Charles, by exposing these files, wasn't just protecting the crown. He was burning bridges. Bridges that may never be rebuilt. And yet, the files raised another question. If Charles was willing to expose Harry, what else might he be hiding? What other secrets lay buried in those vaults, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? Because in the monarchy, every secret is a weapon. And in this war, weapons were being unsheathed faster than anyone could have imagined. Which leads us to the next shocking twist. Because if Meghan thought the files were the worst of it, she was wrong. Her counterstrike was coming. A desperate gamble, fueled by outrage, that would take the feud to an even darker, more dangerous level. Because what came next wasn't just about secrets on paper. It was about a war fought in public, with no rules, no limits, and no going back. What do you do when you feel cornered? When every headline mocks you? When your power crumbles? When the world cheers your downfall? For Meghan Markle, the answer was simple. You fight back. You don't retreat. You don't surrender. You counterstrike. And that's exactly what she set out to do in the wake of King Charles's devastating blow. The files had been exposed. The world now believed Charles's narrative. Harry was the betrayer, the unreliable son, the prince who had abandoned duty. Meghan, in turn, was cast as the manipulative outsider, the woman who fueled his rebellion. It was brutal, but Meghan knew something the palace didn't. Perception isn't fixed. It can be bent, shaped, controlled. And if Charles wanted to play the long game of records and files, Meghan would play the fast game of media, spectacle, and outrage. Her first move? Reclaim the narrative. Late-night strategy sessions filled the Sussex mansion. Lawyers on Zoom. PR gurus flying in from New York and Los Angeles. Phone calls to sympathetic journalists who had long framed Meghan as the victim of royal cruelty. And at the center of it all was Meghan, pacing, dictating, planning. If they want war, they'll get war, she reportedly said. Step one was the press. Suddenly, articles began to appear, not in tabloids, but in carefully chosen outlets. Pieces highlighting Meghan's resilience, Harry's trauma, the couple's courage in the face of a vindictive monarchy. Interviews were lined up, not with bombastic talk show hosts, but with empathetic voices who could frame the Sussexes as victims once again. The strategy was clear. Flip the script. Make Charles look like the cold tyrant. Paint Meghan and Harry as the human cost of a ruthless crown. But here's the contradiction. The harder Meghan pushed the victim narrative, the less it resonated. Sympathy fatigue had set in. People remembered Oprah. They remembered the docuseries. They remembered Spare. And this time, instead of gasps, they rolled their eyes. The public wanted something new, something shocking, not recycled grievances. Meghan's media machine sputtered. And yet, she refused to stop. Step two was the big gamble, a Netflix project. Rumors swirled that Meghan pitched a docu-series tentatively titled The Truth About the Crown. It would go beyond Harry's memoir, beyond Oprah, beyond anything they had done before. Secret recordings, private letters, friends and allies speaking out on camera. It was to be the ultimate weapon, a global stage where Meghan could expose the monarchy one revelation at a time. Can you imagine the fallout if that had aired? Imagine Meghan sitting before the camera, eyes brimming with tears, recounting late-night phone calls, icy silences, and veiled threats. Imagine Harry reluctantly joining her, voice trembling as he read from his father's alleged words. I have the records. I know the truth. The power of such imagery would have been immense. But there was a problem. Netflix hesitated. Executives questioned whether the Sussex brand was still bankable. Some worried about legal repercussions. Others feared audience backlash. And in that hesitation, Meghan saw her grip slipping further. What she had counted on as her counterstrike risked becoming just another failed deal. So, she turned to step three, Sir Timothy. If she couldn't rebuild her own image, She would tear down the man who had replaced Harry. Whispers began almost immediately. Meghan allegedly hired private investigators to dig into Timothy's past. His naval career, his marriage to, and his quiet years of service. Everything was scrutinized. Old acquaintances were contacted. Journalists were tipped off. The goal was clear: find a crack in his armor. Find anything that could undermine his sudden rise. But Sir Timothy was a fortress. Decades of discretion left little for Meghan to exploit. The very qualities that made him Charles's choice made him unassailable. No scandals, no interviews, no loose words. Silence was his shield, and it drove Meghan mad. So she pivoted. If she couldn't destroy Timothy, she would sow doubt about the king himself. Allegations began circulating, rumors of favoritism, of Charles elevating Timothy not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Some stories even suggested financial ties, that Timothy's quiet service masked secret deals. None of it was proven. Most of it was speculation. But speculation was enough. In the world of media warfare, planting doubt is often more powerful than proving truth. But here's where the emotional beat lands hardest. Harry, caught in the middle of Meghan's counterstrike, grew uneasy. He knew the files existed. He knew his father had leverage. He feared that the harder Meghan fought, the more the palace would retaliate. But Meghan refused to slow down. To her, retreat was defeat. And so the gap between them widened. Harry, paralyzed by fear of what might come next. Meghan, consumed by the fire of her own outrage. And the public? They watched in fascination. Some admired Meghan's refusal to stay silent. Others mocked her desperation. Polls showed trust in the Sussexes slipping further. But controversy kept them in the headlines, and for Meghan, that was better than silence. Now, let me ask you this. What happens when both sides refuse to back down? When a monarchy armed with centuries of secrecy collides with a woman armed with cameras, microphones, and relentless determination? Who wins? The crown with its files, or the actress with her platform? Because Meghan's counterstrike wasn't just noise. It was a declaration of war. And war always escalates. And escalate it did. Because Meghan's outrage didn't stay contained within the walls of Montecito. It spilled out into the streets, into the headlines, into the lives of neighbors and strangers alike. And what unfolded next turned a private feud into a public ruckus. One that no one, not even Meghan herself, could control. Because what came next wasn't strategy. It was chaos. And Montecito was about to explode. How much pressure can one mansion hold before it bursts? How long can whispers inside polished walls stay quiet when the world outside is roaring? Montecito, that sun-soaked paradise of palm trees and mansions, was about to discover what happens when royal scandal collides with Hollywood spectacle. And it wasn't pretty. It began as a trickle. A few paparazzi cars parked discreetly on the edges of the neighborhood. A handful of drones buzzing overhead, their faint hum slicing through the California air. Neighbors annoyed, rolling their eyes, used to the occasional fuss when Harry and Meghan made news. But this time, this wasn't just a fuss. This was a flood. The headlines had already set the stage. Meghan's counterstrike was in motion, Charles's files were leaking, Sir Timothy's star was rising. The world wanted more. They wanted a glimpse of Meghan's fury, of Harry's humiliation. And Montecito became the battlefield. Reporters lined the streets. Fans and critics alike drove hours just to pass by the Sussex mansion, snapping selfies at the gates like tourists at a crime scene. Imagine that. The home they'd built for peace becoming a zoo, a cage, a spectacle. Inside, the tension boiled. Meghan couldn't leave without being photographed, scrutinized, mocked. Harry couldn't jog down the street without headlines claiming he looked broken, gaunt, defeated. Even their children, shielded carefully from cameras, became part of the frenzy, as neighbors whispered about the noise, the shouting, the endless stream of consultants arriving at odd hours. Montecito, once a haven, had become a stage, and the audience was global. And here's the emotional irony. Meghan and Harry left the UK claiming they wanted privacy, freedom, normalcy. But in California, under the harsh glare of the American paparazzi, they had less privacy than ever. Every Starbucks run, every school pickup, every tense moment caught and dissected. Can you feel the weight of that contradiction? The very place they thought would save them was the place that amplified their downfall. But the real ruckus wasn't just outside. It was inside. Neighbors later described hearing raised voices echoing from behind those mansion walls. One neighbor swore she heard Meghan shouting during a late-night argument, her voice cutting through the still air like glass. Another claimed Harry was seen pacing the garden alone, head in his hands, muttering to himself as though rehearsing an argument he couldn't win. These weren't the polished royals of staged photo shoots. These were two people unraveling under pressure, and Meghan's frustration turned outward. Reports suggest she lashed out at staff, assistants quitting suddenly, citing a toxic environment. Security detail reportedly complained of endless shifts, guarding a property under siege by drones and flashing cameras. Lawyers came and went, their expensive cars lined up in the driveway like an emergency task force. Meghan wanted solutions. Meghan demanded control, but control was slipping fast. The chaos spilled beyond the gates. Montecito residents, wealthy, private, used to quiet luxury, grew restless. Some demanded action from local authorities, calling the Sussexes a nuisance, an attraction, even a burden on their once peaceful community. Others gossiped gleefully, thrilled at the drama in their own backyard. Imagine dinner parties where billionaires whispered about the screaming matches next door, where wine glasses clinked to the soundtrack of scandal. Meghan and Harry weren't just tabloid fodder anymore. They were neighborhood gossip, the kind you can't escape. And then came the clashes. Paparazzi skirmishes on the streets. Reporters chasing cars. One drone shot down by frustrated security, sparking a minor police report. Locals caught in the crossfire, furious at having their tranquil lives disrupted by a drama they never asked for. Montecito was no longer quiet. It was chaos. But here's the twist. Meghan, instead of retreating, leaned into it. If the world wanted a spectacle, she would give them one. Carefully staged outings with Harry, walking hand in hand, but with tension obvious in their faces. Subtle fashion choices, outfits that screamed symbolism, leaked tidbits to friendly outlets, painting the Sussexes as besieged victims in their own home. It was theater, painful, awkward, sometimes transparent, but theater nonetheless. And the audience couldn't look away. Yet Harry struggled. Every outing felt like humiliation. Every camera flashed a reminder of what he'd lost. He wasn't the proud veteran in uniform anymore. He wasn't the prince walking behind the queen's coffin. He was the man whose father had erased him, whose titles belonged to another, whose life was now reduced to paparazzi chasing him down Californian roads. Can you picture the weight of that shame? A soldier, a son, a prince, now stripped, diminished, cornered. And the pressure cooker boiled hotter. Friends reported Harry drinking more. Late-night calls to old military companions.